But yeah, I mean, where else are we going to start other than the obvious? Can I quote Sex and the City?
Yes, sure.
So for those who don't know, for who's never heard me talk about this before, my mom and I, for I don't know when it was, the early part of the 2000s, we were the only two people living in our house. And the bonding activity that we, mother and son, chose to do together was watch Sex and the City. So I'm admittedly a very big Sex and the City fan. And I tend to think of lines from the show when I'm trying to come up with stuff to, make something fit. And there's a line from Sex and the City in which Carrie is talking about Mr. Big, played by the immortal Chris Noth. Andrew, are you a big Sex and the City fan? No, he's shaking his head. Jeremy, I'm assuming you're not either.
I have not seen it.
Okay, so do you neither of you guys know much about their relationship in the show?
No, I do. I know about that. I actually saw the first movie on a plane.
That's not anything like having watched the series. Neither.
I know that, but you're asking me if I know the relationship, and I'm just giving you context. So,
but that's after. So that's like after the storm.
I know that two characters exist, and I know they have had an on and off again relationship. Is that appropriate? Is that acceptable?
Yes, and there was much pain inflicted by Big towards Carrie throughout the show, and at one point, I should know which season the line was set in, but I don't. But it was, at some point you've used up all your tears on a certain, like every relationship gets a certain amount of tears allotted to it. And at some point you use all of them up and they're gone and you don't have any left. And I feel like the only appropriate entree into our conversation about one Frank Ntilikina is for me to just start out by admitting I used up all my tears on Frank a long time ago. And this is not going to be a surprise to anyone who's read a newsletter from this year in which I mentioned Frank, or anybody who's listened to this podcast in which we talked about Frank. I ran out of energy. So we'll talk about him and I will say some words and you will say some words and words will be exchanged. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like today is some incredibly sad day because Frank Ntilikina is no longer a Knick. I can't do it. I don't have it in me. And I just feel like the only appropriate way for me to start out this episode is by admitting that. So there it is.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair in the sense of it feels like maybe the last 2 seasons you've kind of been leaving the island.
I don't know that I would say, I mean, if you really want to get into it, I think.
Well, yes, I do.
Okay, let's get into it.
Let's get into it.
Let's get into it.
What are we going to do?
No, okay. So let's go back 2 years to the draft, 2019 draft, the RJ Barrett draft. And I mentioned this in my newsletter this week. There was, I think it was Berman had the rumor that the Knicks were, I don't know, it wasn't like actively shopping, but like it seemed like he was on his way out. And then he survived that night. And then that season, of course, was the second Fizdale season. And I mean, that there was Alondro Trier and there was, Elfrid Payton was injured and like we got enough Frank that year. And there was some decent Frank that year that like I personally had not let go of the rope yet. And then that was the season where he missed the last, 30 some odd games, 20 some odd games. He missed the end. He missed the end of the season.
He missed, it was like maybe 35 games, but then he came back and then he got hurt again. And that was like, but before he got hurt that last time where he did not finish the season, and then obviously the pandemic shut things down and the Knicks didn't go to the bubble. But like leading up to that, there was still gasps of air in me towards like, okay, let's get on the mountaintop. Let's mount the soapbox one more time and just yell into the clouds about why this person needs to be playing. And then he got injured and then they finished that horrible, miserable, no good, very good, or no good, very bad season. And then we got to this year and this year was this year, which was a really good, fun fucking year in which we got a lot of things to root for and a lot of players to really get behind. And like, Emmanuel quickly stole all of our hearts and Julius Randle made an All-NBA team. And like, I could go on and on and on. And
I don't know exactly when it happened this year, but at some point this year, I definitely was like, yeah, I have only so much energy and I'm going to devote it towards like covering and analyzing and thinking about the team that I'm seeing on the floor, which is really pretty fucking good and a lot of fun. And Frank's not really a part of that. And you know what? Whether that's right or wrong, I don't care anymore. I don't care. So when did it happen exactly? I don't know. Maybe with that last injury the previous season, if you want to try to nail it down.
The second season.
No, the third. This was his fourth season. So the injury that ended his third season.
But what ended his third season was COVID.
So then this is why you can't, it's impossible to have a discussion about Frank, because like there have been so many things that have happened over the course of time. I thought he was injured and ended his third season, like was not on the active roster because he was hurt. Like by the time they got to that last Atlanta game. But you're telling me he was still active?
No, he was. I mean, if we're talking about the Hawks game,
the Hawks
COVID
game.
season,
so he was active.
I mean, the game before that was his Washington game. That was when he posted 20 and 10.
So I'm confused. You're right. I'm confusing his second year and his third year.
Right.
Which again, there's just so much history there.
Sure,
I can't even keep it straight.
If memory serves, I remember you.
You're right. No, you're
writing
right.
a newsletter about Dennis Smith Jr. and kind of like Frank is the forgotten man. And the focus is on DSJ.
Before which season?
Before the fourth season, this past season.
Yeah, I think I probably wrote that because I think my viewpoint before this past season was that I thought if anybody could get Dennis Smith Jr. back on track, it would be Tom Thibodeau. And I thought,
but then why? I'm just curious. Why doesn't the same be said for Frank?
Because I thought Dennis, I mean, it's funny to say now because, you know, Dennis Smith Jr. was like a non-person this year. Because he was Dennis Smith Jr., at least in theory, was an aggressive driving point guard who needed to have a lot of kinks worked out in his game. But I thought there was still the guy there that had not a good rookie season, but like did things during his rookie season. And I thought if he could get his head on straight and he like bought in and the whole thing, maybe Tibbs would be able to resurrect his career. And I recall specifically, I think in a preseason episode, we did a crossover with Locked On Knicks. I think I was like, Dennis Smith Jr. is going to like open this. I think that was my crazy prediction that Dennis Smith Jr. would open the season as the starting point guard and like he would actually be decent. So much for that. So yeah, I'm sorry. It really does all run together at this point with Frank. The injuries, the benchings, the this, that, the other thing. And it's like, it's because I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about him over the last year.
I guess it feels like, and I'm seeing this with Mitch too, this idea of kind of like these players are injury prone, where they have one significant injury earlier in their career, and then they have nagging things here and there, and they're labeled injury prone, which to me, that doesn't constitute as injury prone, right? Like Porzingis. At first, it was like me saying, oh no, he's not injury prone. It's fine. But then they pile up to a much greater extent than something like with Frank or with Mitch. I mean, it seemed like it wasn't even just the ACL. It was other things with Porzingis, like the ankle injury. And then when he called himself the lizard or whatever it was, the fact that he's did he do that? yeah. I think because he regenerates and grows back.
Talk about things that blocked out of my memory.
Right. Yeah. Or how he played one April game the entire time he was with the Knicks.
Yeah.
And then didn't play the fourth season. And then the fifth season, they still didn't play an April game because of COVID. And then he played a few games in the bubble and then got hurt and then missed it. Bottom line is, I feel like with Frank, I get it, right? I understand why people are out on him. I also see why people are very much in on him. I lean more to the side of being in on him. And it's a sort of thing where I get it, at a certain point, Frank has to step up 100%. I also look at the circumstances that kind of circle his entire Knicks tenure and how basically, if you think about it, the one constant over the last 4 seasons up until a week ago, not even, was Frank Ntilikina, which just goes to show you the dysfunction of a roster and of a franchise. I mean, the idea of you get drafted and the person who is responsible for drafting you and the vision that they have of the team and the role you're going to play. And I understand if if pure triangle is more outdated and it could have been somewhat of a, I don't want to say failure, but it wouldn't have gone very well, at least without other actions running and a more modern offense. But Jackson's out. And then Steve Mills, the incomparable Steve Mills, rises to power. They inherit a coach. He hires Scott Perry, and you've certainly said enough glowing things about Scott Perry where we don't have to rehash them, but he hires both of them. Yeah. Or he hires him. You can't fire Jeff Hornacek because that's really awkward. And that's not going to be a good look.
They probably could have, but they didn't.
I don't think so. The idea of coming in and being like, hey, I've risen to power, I'm going to fire the head coach. It would have been a bad look. Even if we like or dislike Jeff Hornacek. Yeah. To me, he's very milquetoast. I don't, he was like, okay, cool.
It would not
the wonder bread of coaches. Whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It would not have been the expected thing. I think most people would have been like, well, why fire Jeff Hornacek? What was Jeff Hornacek supposed to do last year?
Right. Exactly. So Jeff Hornacek's there. The Knicks bring in players who are supposed to guide Frank. And maybe they do, from a developmental standpoint. We don't really know what happens behind closed doors. But I do know that, bringing in Jarrett Jack, for example, Ramon Sessions, who then was kicked out, it felt like the Knicks were trying to take ridiculous next steps that weren't good next steps. It was like, hey, we're just trying not to be the worst teams here or among the worst teams. And lo and behold, they were pretty bad. Bad enough where they were in Kevin Knox range, but not bad enough where they could have gotten to, Luka Doncic, DeAndre Ayton, whatever that top 5 was.
Yeah. Trae Young.
And all of that's happening. Frank Ntilikina really isn't seeing much time on the court, which is frustrating because you want to get value out of your first round pick, let alone a lottery pick. I think the one thing that gets lost in a lot of people is the picks from 6 to 10. There's this expectation of that guy needs to be a starter. And the funny thing is that history doesn't prove that a lot of those guys are starters. It varies from number to number, right? Like 8 is a graveyard of awful draft picks, but 9 is phenomenal. And yet, of course, the Knicks, they didn't do well at 8 with Frank, but they also didn't do well at 9 with Knox. So the point being that it's very hit or miss. It's not like the baseline has to be a starter. No, the baseline is probably a backup. Unfortunately, that's just the randomness of how the NBA lottery is, or the draft in that sense, and the level of talent that's likely to exist in a draft class. So
but can I just jump in? Sure. I wonder, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I wonder how much of that is, and this is going to relate to the Knicks and not the current Knicks, but the previous regime in particular. I wonder how much of that has to do with the fact that teams that are drafting often in the top 10 are not the best NBA franchises. Not all the time. Obviously, there are certainly exceptions, but much of the time, they are not the best NBA franchises. And, you get teams that draft in that range oftentimes year after year after year. This is not the Knicks, because the Knicks often traded away those picks before they had a chance to make them. But I just wonder what that has to do with it, and whether there are GMs around the league that see what teams often do and who they pick and how they develop those players. And they're like, wow, what a joke. If you gave me a chance to have a pick that high, I would do, much, much better. Now, again, who the hell knows? Because this is we're talking in things that are impossible to prove. But I don't know. I don't know how much of an excuse that actually is for. I understand you're just trying to put it in context, but I think there's more to it.
But that's the thing. If I'm by applying context, that's further trying to show the lens of what really happened, right? That if we're going to talk about where things went wrong, we have to provide context.
I think that.
Because here's the thing. Clearly the Knicks did not see Frank as an on-ball player. No matter who was in charge, they didn't. They tried it. It wasn't working. They wanted a more aggressive player. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have a role. And that's why when the second season rolled around, and it was the inaugural Fizdale year.
Yes.
And I get why you have Kevin Knox out there, because they finally leaned into being bad. It was at a certain point where it's like, great. We're not going to be a good team. Let's try. But I even if you asked them at the beginning of the year, they wouldn't have said, let's tank for Zion, because first of all, Zion was not Zion until like November. And they had an entire free agency where they effectively, and it wasn't free agency. I mean, they couldn't do anything, right? Yeah, Cantor opted in. And so they had really no choice. They then basically signed Hazonia and Mitchell Robinson to a contract.
Yep.
That was it. So they didn't want to be that bad, but then they realized, oh, this is a bad team. Zion's doing well. We'll lean into it. And also they thought they could use their connections or whatever to land two superstars, and it didn't happen. But even while all that's going on and you're running Kevin Knox out there, for most of the games that he's playing, and it's he was the rookie of the month in, I think, December, right? So you think, okay, there's tangible progress there, but you still have, Ntilikina languishing on the bench. He's getting DNPs for no reason. And then that's what makes it even more frustrating. Of course, the injuries that he had, specifically the groin injury that caused him to miss so much time, that sucked. But because of the fact that he also had missed time for just like run of the mill DNPs, it's like, okay, what is like, that could have been time that could have been used to try to work this out. Of course, this is during a second year when there's more hope, there's more promise. It's like, there's an asset here. Try to at least build it up a little bit. Don't just let it diminish to zero.
So I think you've nailed a couple of inflection points on the Frank tenure, but I do want to get back to something you said earlier, but just to recap. So his rookie year, after they draft him, they signed Jared Jack. Jared Jack's the starter. I don't think that's one of the inflection points, because I don't think it's uncommon for a team to like not want to start a rookie point guard from game one, especially one that's, what was he, 19 when he was drafted? 18, 19?
It's 18.
He's 18. Okay. So I don't think that's like an inflection point. And I think all things considered, they ran him out there a good deal as a rookie. I think he played an appropriate amount of minutes as a rookie for the most part. Could you have played him a little bit more down the stretch? Sure. Were there some misgivings? Absolutely. I think the inflection points all came in season 2. One, which Schwinn, if you're listening, hi Schwinn, he ranted and raved about this for years. He may still be ranting and raving about it. Is when they Fizdale played Frank 5 minutes in the, hold on, I have it up right here. The Orlando game. He had been starting the whole season before that. Benched him, didn't put him back in the game. He never started another game for. He started the last 2 games of that season, which gets us to the second inflection point, which was the final injury, which is what I was mistakenly thinking happened during his third season, happened during his second, where the Miami game was his last game, because he had been reinserted into the starting lineup. You think, okay, another chance here to prove himself, and he went down with an injury. I think that the third year, so when RJ's on the team, that mess of a 2019-20 season, the last Fizdale year, I feel like the ship had already not sailed, but the sails were up, right? By that point,
the writing was on the wall, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't have tried to make it work.
No. Yeah, I mean, yes, that you're right. That doesn't mean that they couldn't have tried to make it work, and they didn't try to make it work. I guess where I'm, and thank you for reminding me about the Washington game. How could I ever forget the 20 points in his second to last game of that season? But like, all right, so you want to give me COVID as a third inflection point? Like, who knows what would have happened towards the end of that year? I don't know. That's fair. But like, we're talking about all these inflection points. And again, admittedly, a lot of this shit has run together in my head because it's just, it has. At some point, and I am not the first or the second or the 100th person to say this, but like, he played how many minutes total? I don't know. You may have it up in front of you. How many total minutes do you think Frank played in his NBA career?
I do have it up in front of me.
Oh, okay. So then it's not really
4,119.
So it's 4,000, over 4,000 minutes. You get a possession for your team, roughly, once a minute, 24-second shot clock. Not perfect science, right? but it's about. So what did he have maybe to work with over the course? 4,000, 4,200, 4,500 possessions on the offensive side of the ball over the 4 years he was with the team. It's really tough for me. And again, I'm not excusing all the jerking around they did. And if you ask me, could you concoct in a lab a worse scenario for a rookie to try to go into a league and acclimate himself and gain a foothold? I think the Knicks pretty much nailed it. They were like, we have figured out the way to try to fuck this kid over as much as humanly possible. Let's go ahead and do it. And they did it. It's almost as if you told me that, I'd be like, you know what? It's that reasonable. That's how much they jerked him around. All that being said, it's not like he didn't have an opportunity, which is, and again, I've probably made this speech at some point over the last year. The fault is not all on the Knicks. I don't know if it's 50-50. I don't know if it's 60-40 one way or another. I don't know if it's 70-30 one way or another. You could tell me it's any of those things. But the guy played 4,000 minutes in a Knicks uniform. And by the end of that time, not only did the Knicks think he was worth bringing back, and Tibbs seemed to like him for what it's worth, but 28 other teams, or 29 other teams, I guess, waited a month and a half. And then Dallas signed him just now. Now, might there be some other reasons why? You're giving me a face, and that's fine. But
I'm giving you a face just because I think I understand what you're saying in terms of the minutes. But look at how many of those possessions Frank was told to just stand in the corner and wait, and then the ball never arrived to him. But
this gets us back to the same thing, which is like, was told to stand in the corner and the ball never arrived to him.
Yeah,
okay. Part of why we loved Frank for so many years is because he didn't force the issue to the detriment of his team. He cared more about doing what he was told and fitting in a role and just being able to be out there and help the team win, right? That's what we love about Frank. But doesn't every player in the NBA need to have a certain amount of shit to him where
but he said in the past, I want to play more. I want more responsibilities. He said that. And why wouldn't he, right? What player would say, I don't want the ball more than I have it? I'm good.
1,000%. And for Frank to have been like, you know what? Fuck what they're telling me. I'm getting the ball at the top of the key. I'm driving the lane. I don't really care what they're telling me to do. That would have been so beyond out of character for him. And it would take away some of what made us fall in love with him in the first place. And at the same time, if he had taken that approach at any point in time in his tenure, you know what? I bet some of the people upstairs would be like, who's that guy? That's not the guy that we've had all these misgivings about for all these years. But he never did that. Am I saying he should have? It's not it shouldn't be his job to overturn the decision making of the people who place him in a certain role. I get that, and yes, they're the ones who fucked up by not bringing him along in a way that would have brought the most out of him as a player. But I'm just going to go back and repeat the same thing. At some point, I think you do need to force the issue, and you never force the issue.
But again, it's the sort of thing, and I see what you're saying. I understand where you're coming from, but it's kind of like, okay, forcing the issue. It seemed at every step of the way, the front office brought in players that we knew were going to block him. Right?
I'm not disagreeing with that.
Right. So I guess that's, you can say that Frank should have been more aggressive, that he wasn't filling in the role that should have been there. But then it goes back to, okay, if the front office knew that, then why did they keep him? If that wasn't going to be who he is, why can't you find someone who says, great, I understand what his strengths are. Let me maximize those and do what I can do.
I think he would have been gone 2 years ago if they could have gotten any ounce molecule.
We saw reports about it.
Particle.
We saw reports about second round picks
of value. And you know what? He was not traded for a second round pick on draft night in 2019. We always assumed / hoped at the time and afterwards that the reason he wasn't traded for a second round pick in 2019 was because they wised up and be like, what are we doing? This guy just helped beat Team USA for France. Why would we trade him for a second round pick? When the reality of the situation is they may not have gotten an offer of a second round pick that was halfway decent.
Of course, that's very possible. But
that was 2 years ago.
But John, if you feel like, hey, this guy that we have, we're not going to play him at all, so let's just let him languish and not trade him, period. I mean, if there were reports that there was at least one offer with second round picks on the table. Thank you. My cat agrees. So it's the sort of thing where if you need to do something to get a value out of him, but they chose not to. And that's the thing. I want to go back to what you wrote in your newsletter, because, you know, and the reason I don't want to say picking it apart, but you wrote something that I feel like is great text for us to go from. So, I mean, you said for all the little things he does that made a segment of the fan base fall in love with him, Ntilikina is a player who 3 different coaches looked at and thought, I can do better.
Yeah.
So that, and I'll give you the floor in a second, but have you been in jobs where your boss makes you feel small, makes you feel like you're,
well, I'm only 5'6", so it's not that hard to make me feel small.
Emotionally small.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So you know how tough it is to shine.
Yeah.
When you know that the person in charge has no thoughts or care whatsoever to try to help you improve, that they're always looking for other people. And that's that. And it's, you know, it's on you to try to swim, right? You have to do things, but we're talking about something where it's like, what opportunity do you really have? And I think that's what drives me crazy. It's like, if we're talking about David Fizdale being maybe the worst fucking coach that we've ever seen, how are we then turning it around and using it against Frank as like, well, genius David Fizdale was the one who said, this isn't going to work. I'm going to find other players. So it's not, it seems that the culture to me for the Knicks has been survival consistently. How are we going to get out of this alive? Right. That's how Steve Mills was able to go from down here to up here.
Yes.
He was never in basketball operations. He was a finance guy, and he was a shit manager of the salary cap, which is hilarious to me. I mean, just so many instances.
He's a guy who was very good at keeping his job for another day.
Right.
That's what he specialized in.
Yes. And every move the Knicks made essentially was survival. The one thing I'd say, maybe it was the project focus of Kevin Knox. It was like, hey, we can build this guy up, but they didn't have the infrastructure to do that. So clearly,
and also Kevin Knox might not be that good.
I mean, if we could have a Kevin Knox conversation, but I think
you don't need to have a Kevin Knox.
Well, I'll say one thing: the biggest difference, because you could say, well, what about Kevin Knox? Why are you treating Frank with kid gloves and not Knox? Knox had far more ample opportunity to show what he can do, and we've seen it with Frank. Well, it still feels Knox started how many games in his rookie year, and then got opportunity to play his second year. Was blocked by Morris, of course.
I'm going to push back. I'm going to push back on this because briefly, Frank was never given carte blanche that Knox was, without question. But the rug that was pulled out from under Knox after he was told, this is how we're going to develop you. He was told that we're going to develop you by letting you go out, fucking play through your mistakes. There will be no fault on your on your part by going out, experimenting, trying to figure it out. And like, we're with you for that. We are on board with you for that whole process. We're going to give you the 3 years that Calipari says you're going to need. And that lasted 1 year. And then he came back in the second year and be like, oh yeah, all that shit we told you about figuring your shit out on the fly. Yeah, that's not going to go anymore. We need to win now because, as you just said, we all need to save our asses. And Kevin Knox was like, what? Oh, okay. And then he tried to basically, he went from doing trying all the stuff. I'm getting off on a tangent.
But Knox missed one game in his second season, which was the COVID year, right? He was still playing 18 minutes a game. And then the Knicks gave him the opportunity to have a solid backup spot under Tibbs, right?
Yeah.
And what did he do? He blew it.
Take advantage of it. Because he was already, I think he was a broken player by this year.
Sure. That could be the case. But this, again, it goes into the whole thing of the mindset of how are we going to get by the skin of our teeth? They don't want to thrive. They want to survive. And I mean, look, again, I still I've wiped my hands clean of Knox, but I still recognize that he is a victim of this entire situation.
We're all victims.
Right. Okay. So if they're all victims,
no one's disagreeing with that. I'm just, coaches coach to save their jobs too.
Of course, because Mike Miller did the same thing.
Exactly.
Fizz was doing the same thing.
Hornets. Oh shit! Right. I was wrong. That line is.
It was four coaches.
It was four coaches.
Right.
Wow. Talk about things I've wiped from my mind. The Mike Miller era. How you doing? Look, coaches want to win games, often to the detriment of the franchise that they coach for. if they thought Frank could help them win games, I think they would have given Frank a chance to help them win games.
Yes.
At the end of the day, I'm sorry for oversimplifying it like that, but I think at sometimes in oversimplification, there is truth that lies within that.
And I'm not denying that. Again, Frank was responsible for a lot of what he could and couldn't do. I understand that he didn't necessarily fit what the Knicks want right now, right? Which is they want someone of the archetype who can pull up, who can catch and shoot, who can pass well, who's not as hesitant, who can drive. Frank checks off maybe the spot up shooting. He checks off the defensive as well. But I guess that's the thing, right? It seems like if what we saw from Frank this past season, and even if he was used sparingly, it went on long enough where it felt like, hey, like he's still connecting on shots. This isn't just like a 10-game sample size fluke. Like it went on longer, and I think he was like almost the 90th percentile in spot up shooting. Again, there is value in a player. It's just a matter of if he fits what the Knicks are doing. He did not. And how you can maximize that even further. And basically,
and they didn't do it.
Right. But again, that then goes back to the broader point as well, which is that the Knicks purposely brought in players who were better than Frank. Of course they were better than Frank, but it's the thing where it's like,
yes,
at a certain point, no one was in Frank's corner. The only person who was in Frank's corner mutually agreed to leave the organization a week and a half later, if that.
I am 100% on board with every single thing that you're saying. I think we can end it here. They never gave Frank an honest to goodness chance to be what his destiny is in the NBA, which is something between a really good seventh man on a good team or maybe a lower level eighth man on a mediocre team. All of us who are in Frank's corner at this point in time believe if he ever goes on to play for an NBA champion, and who knows, maybe Dallas becomes that next year, wouldn't shock me in the least. That is what he is. He's a 7th/8th man. Right. And that is my point. We have been sitting here and fucking arguing about this for 4 fucking years over a 7.5 man. I'm sorry, but that's not what you're supposed to get from the 8th pick in the draft.
But I just talked to you about the fact that the expectation is supposed to be the starter, and that's really not the case. That it's a backup player, which is the fucking 7.5 man, is it not? If we're talking about players in that baseline, that is exactly what he is. And at a certain point in the beginning, sure, it's this feeling of, the sky's the limit, all this stuff, and you think he can be a better player.
Fine.
But then it gets to a point where it's like, okay, cool. He's how many times have we said Swiss Army knife type of player
100%.
who can just come off the bench and be a productive player for that role. Right.
And so you know what? Maybe he was worth the pick. He wasn't worth the argument.
That's to you. But again, I'll say this, and then if you want to end it, we can go there. You wrote, and I want to quote you here because I want to make sure it's correct. All right. So I'm gonna, as I banter, to look to find it, right? Because I was surprised. I was surprised when I saw it, and I'm sure you know what I'm going to say. And I'm doing a great job of stalling for time because it doesn't seem to be here.
Donovan Mitchell thing?
Found it. Sure. What's funny is that of all the things I've written about him, not once have I ever typed out the words that most accurately describe his place in Knicks history: the biggest draft mistake the franchise ever made. Huh. Frank Ntilikina is the biggest draft mistake the Knicks have ever made.
And I went on to clarify that is not to say that he's the worst. Like, there was a better player they could have taken, and instead they took this other guy, and then comparing those two guys. Because specifically, I wanted to point out that they were in on Donovan Mitchell. They were very serious about possibly taking Donovan Mitchell. And they went on to eventually take Frank instead after whatever discussions they had internally. Of course, there were better players that were passed on by picks the Knicks have had that they reasonably could have used on another player. I mentioned one of them, Nikola Jokic. They passed on to take fucking Clay Anthony early.
That's the second round. I mean, like every team pretty much then passed on Nikola Jokic.
Yeah, but my point in writing that is because that was a moment where they could have gone the other direction, reasonably speaking, and they didn't. They went with Frank instead of Donovan Mitchell. Donovan Mitchell is probably going to make an All-NBA team this year. He's going to be a top 15 player in the league. Frank Ntilikina is a guy who is, I don't know, if you asked every GM around the league to make a top 250 list, how many of those lists is he appearing on?
Obviously it's none, but the point, what I don't understand from this list, right? It's like,
what?
I get you're not honing in on it was specifically Frank and look at the difference, right? But like the Knicks are also in a similar position where like they picked a worse French player in Frederick Weiss. And they picked him over the man who is now known as Meta World Peace.
Yeah, but again,
I still don't fully understand what you're saying here, because isn't every worst pick or like every bad pick inherently like the Knicks should have picked so-and-so? The Knicks should have done this instead.
So I should have made it even more clear, which is to say, if there were other situations in the past, and like, for instance, they drafted Bill Bellamy, or not Bill Bellamy, Jesus Christ, Bill Bradley over some players of some renown. Like, were they really in on those other guys? No, because it was always going to be Bill Bradley. Bill Bradley was like no doubt about it. Like, he was always going to be the first pick in that draft. There was no decision-making process. Is it possible that they were really on the fence about taking Ron Artest instead of Frederick Weiss, and then at the last second they took Weiss? Maybe, and maybe I just don't remember it. Would that be in this conversation? Sure, but Ron Artest never made an All-Star team. Donovan Mitchell is going to be one of the defining characters in this league for the next decade, and they were very close to being in on him.
Right.
I think they were.
But wouldn't it be worse?
Just based on everything I've read.
But wouldn't it be a worse situation if the Knicks just completely didn't want Donovan? Like, we know they tried to trade in for Donovan Mitchell. We know they wanted a second pick to be able to snatch him up. Wouldn't it be a worse situation if the Knicks had zero interest whatsoever? Like Bam Adebayo, when the Knicks picked Kevin Knox over Bam, and Bam was on the same, right? Wasn't that the same year?
He worked out for them.
Or is it? No, it's 2017. 2017 was the
no,
right?
No, Bam. Okay, so no, you're right. Again, this is where we get things confused. You're right. Bam was the Frank year,
right?
And then Kevin Knox, they passed on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Michael Porter Jr., Mikal Bridges. Those are the three.
Let's stick with Bam and the Frank year because it's Frank. Bam worked out for the Knicks, and then they just didn't want him. That to me hurts more than the idea of we really want Donovan Mitchell, and we just didn't have the gas to go get him.
Look, I don't care about Donovan Mitchell anymore. I just wrote the sentence because I think it's true, not because it still actively bothers me. It doesn't bother me in the least because we have a team now that I think we're on the verge of doing something very special. And more importantly, we have a new regime. If that regime who made that decision was still in place, if literally any of those people were still in power and still had the authority to make decisions for this franchise, yes, I agree. It would be much worse if they didn't even look his way. But the fact that like there is a reasonable universe that they could have had Donovan Mitchell, like again, it's not something I haven't spent time thinking about this. I just wanted to point it out because I think it's true.
No, I hear you. But then in that sense, if you're happier with where the direction is now, then
I'm very happy with where things are.
Donovan Mitchell and still stuck with the front office. Then I think it's the sort of thing where, like for me, I just accept Frank as cool. I'm happy with where the Knicks are. It was a necessary part of getting to where we are now. It would be great if the Knicks weren't in that place. But no, if we want to do a kind of a what scenario,
hold on, can we
if you get Donovan Mitchell, then what does your team look like? You're not having RJ Barrett, right?
Andrew, can you look up a good flower delivery service in LA? I want to send a dozen bouquets of roses to David Fizdale because by your logic, Jeremy, we should all be singing fucking Fizdale's praises because he's more responsible for the current regime being here than anyone.
100%. The Knicks were a dog shit team for years. We just talked about that. Everyone was focusing on survival, and now we have a front office that doesn't care about that.
Now we're at the point of being happy they took Frank because it helped fuck up things enough that everybody got fired.
What would Donovan Mitchell have done with Steve Mills and Scott Perry? By your logic, you're talking about a team where it's like, okay, cool. We got this guy in here. What are we doing with it? Jeremy, you're doing nothing.
I'm not disagreeing with you, which is why I said a second ago, I'm not sitting here having any regrets. But if I think it's fair to point out when a team makes a mistake in the draft, the words I didn't write were the biggest draft mistake the Knicks ever made and one that still eats at the franchise to this very day. I didn't write those words.
Well, is it not implicit? When you say that it's the biggest draft mistake the team's ever made, isn't that basically saying that's going to carry over?
I didn't mean to apply that at all.
Okay. Because I'm just saying that's the implication that I get when I see this is the worst thing that ever happened. Then that it's still going to haunt the team when it's in recent history.
Not what I meant. I just meant strictly in terms of like looking at the guys that they were reasonably looking at and should have been looking at, and the decision they made purely from that perspective. That's it. That's all.
You guys good? You want to hug it out?